I have worked the intake desk at the Veth-Koral Prime Sector Boundary Station for 19 years, and in that time, I have processed 412 entry applications for the reserve. 411 of them were denied. This is the account of the 412th. My name is Keth Soren. I hold a Grade 7 certification in Wilderness Survey Intake Administration, issued by the Veth-Koral Survey Authority's Central Records Directorate, and I have never lost a file. I mention this not as self-promotion but as context for what follows, because the thing that eventually troubled me most about the case of the human was not what she did inside the reserve. It was that she filed every form correctly, and I could not find a procedural reason to stop her. The Veth-Koral Prime Wilderness Reserve covers approximately 11 million hectares of Class 15 planetary terrain. For reference, a Class 15 ecological designation means the following. The native apex predator load exceeds 6 species in overlapping territory, at least 3 of which are obligate ambush hunters with measurable cognitive response times classified above Tier 2. The reserve has been under preservation management for 430 years. In that time, 47 survey expeditions have attempted full interior traversal. 11 teams returned with incomplete data. 23 teams were extracted, most in non-functional condition. 13 teams were not recovered at all. The word prime in the designation is not a ranking. It is a warning inherited from the original Soviet survey team that classified the planet. Their notation read, primary designation, tier absolute. The short form stuck. My desk sits in the intake station at the sector boundary, a prefab administrative module bolted to a rock shelf 200 meters above the reserve's northern perimeter gate. The gate is not decorative. It is a 2-meter electrified barrier with a biometric lock, a pressure plate on the interior that logs both entry and exit times, and a cable relay that connects to the authority's central monitoring array. The cable relay, I should note, goes dark at day 3 of every interior expedition. The ecology inside the reserve is not hostile to cable relay infrastructure specifically. The ecology is simply hostile to everything that was not born there, and the cable relay was built there 40 years ago. I received the human's application on a Tuesday. I have processed enough applications over 19 years to recognize the shape of a serious one. Recreational applicants tend to attach supporting documentation about their physical conditioning and their species' general hardiness. Research applicants tend to cite prior expedition reports, cross-reference ecological data, and list equipment manifests that are, invariably, insufficient. Military survey applicants, who represent perhaps a third of the serious submissions, attach unit certifications, risk acknowledgement packages, and next-of-kin notification preferences. The human's application contained none of these things. It contained the correct form, filled out in full, with no supplementary materials. The applicant's name was Yara Austin, species, human, world of origin, Veth-Koral Secondary, Class 14, age 31, purpose of entry, field survey, fauna and botanical, duration requested, open-ended, emergency contact designation, none filed. I read that last field 3 times. None filed is not illegal. The emergency contact field is classified as strongly recommended in the authority's intake guidelines, not mandatory. I checked again. I pulled the current edition of the guidelines from the central index and read the relevant section twice. Strongly recommended, not mandatory. I flagged the application for Directive Marshal Soraketh, which is standard procedure for any application to a reserve in the Class 12 tier or above. Directive Marshal Soraketh has occupied the administrative rank above mine for 11 of my 19 years at the station, and in that time, he has denied every reserve entry application he has reviewed. He is thorough, consistent, and correct. The reserve has not recorded a successful full interior traverse in its 430 years of managed status, and the authorities' legal exposure for permitting entry is not trivial. He reviewed the application in approximately 4 minutes and returned it to my desk with a denial stamp and a standard form letter citing insufficient safety certification. I filed the denial. I sent the standard form letter to the contact address on the application. The human replied within the hour. Her reply was brief. She acknowledged receipt of the denial. She noted that the authorities' entry regulations, subsection 7 of the Reserve Management Protocols, included a provision for what was classified as an unescorted independent naturalist entry, a category established, I later confirmed, in the original Reserve Management Framework 430 years ago, when the Solvethian survey team that built the gate had apparently anticipated that individual researchers of sufficient classification would eventually request access. The category had never been invoked. The relevant subsection required only proof of species-equivalent hazard classification, a signed liability waiver, and the standard entry fee. She had attached proof of species-equivalent hazard classification. The document was a Veth-Koral secondary planetary origin certification. The authorities' own hazard equivalency table, which I consulted immediately, listed Class 14 origin as qualifying for entry to reserves up to and including Class 14 ecological tier. The reserve was Class 15. I flagged this discrepancy and returned the application with a secondary denial, citing the 1-tier gap. The human's second reply arrived 20 minutes later. She cited Appendix C of the hazard equivalency table, which I had not read because it is a supplementary appendix, and no application had ever reached the point of requiring it. Appendix C contained a provision for what was classified as a practitioner override, a secondary qualification pathway for applicants who could demonstrate documented field experience in ecologies of equivalent or greater hazard within the prior 5 standard years. She had attached a field log. I read the field log. The field log documented 22 months of unescorted survey work on 3 separate Class 14 worlds and 1 Class 15 world. The Class 15 entry was a secondary survey of the Veth-Koral marginal predator zone, which I cross-referenced against the authorities' own ecology database. The Veth-Koral marginal zone was classified as a Tier 4 apex load environment. She had spent 47 days in it. The authorities' own database listed the maximum documented unescorted duration in that zone as 11 days, achieved by a Solvethian survey team of 4. She had been alone. I looked at the entry duration again, 47 days, alone, in a Class 15 Tier 4 apex load environment that the authorities' own database considered successfully traversed by a 4-person professional team in 11 days. I flagged the field log for Directive Marshal Soraketh. He reviewed it for 7 minutes and returned a third denial. His notation read, Field log unverified, origin classification insufficient for Class 15 reserve, application denied on grounds of insufficient institutional endorsement. I sent the denial. The human's third reply arrived 40 minutes later. She had cross-referenced the authorities' verification protocols for field logs, pulled the relevant contact at the Veth-Koral Marginal Survey Authority, and obtained a verification stamp on her field log within the 40-minute window. The verification stamp was legitimate. I checked the registry. She had clearly had it on file already and was simply waiting for us to require it. She also attached an endorsement letter from the Veth-Koral Marginal Authority's chief surveyor, which noted that her documentation of the marginal predator zone represented the most complete ecological survey of that territory in the zone's recorded history, and that the survey had been conducted without logistical support, emergency extraction capacity, or communication relay after day 3. She then noted that the Directive Marshal's third denial cited insufficient institutional endorsement, and that she now had institutional endorsement. She requested review of the application under the practitioner override pathway. I sat with the file for a while. Directive Marshal Soraketh was not at his desk when I walked the file over. He was in the observation room at the back of the station, watching a Vrethani expedition team prepare for a supported survey of the reserve's outer buffer zone, not the interior, the buffer, and I watched him watch them through the window. They had 16 members, 3 of whom were carrying Class 6 suppression equipment. Their survey brief covered 400 hectares of the buffer. They had a planned duration of 9 days with a 2-day abort window built in. He looked at the file I placed on the corner of the observation console. He looked at it for a long time without picking it up. "File another denial," he said. "On what grounds?" I said. He did not answer immediately. The authorities' regulations, as I had now read them in their entirety 3 times, did not provide an additional grounds category that applied to the human's revised application. The field log was verified. The endorsement was legitimate. The hazard equivalency table's Appendix C criteria were met. The application form was complete and correctly filed. The liability waiver was attached. The entry fee was tendered. "She's a Class 14, he said finally. "The practitioner override pathway does not require Class 15 origin," I said. "It requires documented experience in equivalent hazard environments. She has documented experience in a Class 15 Tier 4 environment. The reserve is Class 15 Tier 3. He looked at me. "Tier 3 is lower than Tier 4, I said, because he appeared to need this said. He took the file. He read it slowly, and I watched his upper arms go still. Soraketh always gestures when he reads, a habit of his species, the secondary limbs cycling through small positional adjustments as his primary attention engages. And when the secondary limbs stopped moving, I understood that he had reached the Veth-Koral section. He was quiet for a moment. "She weighs 53 kilos, he said. I had not looked at the physical profile section. I looked now. He was correct, 53 kilos, 1.62 meters. The physical profile field also listed resting cardiovascular output and neuromuscular response classification, both of which were flagged in the authorities' own system, with notation codes I had to look up. The notation codes referred to a supplementary hazard index for Class 14 and above origin species. The index described what it classified as baseline physiological threshold anomalies in high-stress ecological environments, and its language was, for a regulatory document, unusually pointed. The phrase it used most frequently was "not a limiting variable." I did not read that section aloud. "The regulations are clear," I said. Soraketh put the file down. I processed the application at my desk. I logged the approval under the practitioner override pathway, attached the full documentation chain, and filed the liability waiver under the human's case number. I stamped the entry permit. I set the perimeter gate's biometric log to accept the human's profile. At 7:40 the following morning, Yara Austin walked through the perimeter gate. I watched her from the observation room. She was carrying a survey pack mid-weight, looked to be about 14 kilos, and a field notebook, the paper kind, which I had not seen anyone bring into the reserve in the 19 years I had worked here because paper does not function as a navigation array or an emergency beacon. She wore standard weight survey clothing, no suppression equipment, no class-rated armor. She did not stop at the gate threshold. She walked through at the same pace she had walked across the landing apron, the pace of someone beginning a day's work. The gate logged her entry at 074103. I returned to my desk. At day 3, the cable relay went dark. This was expected. I noted it in the log and returned to the intake queue, which had 3 pending applications for the outer buffer zone's visitor access corridor, the very edge of the reserve's perimeter, 400 meters of managed trail, and I processed those. I denied 2 of them on grounds of insufficient group size for the buffer corridor's minimum party requirement. I approved the third, a school survey group of 11 with a licensed guide, and logged their entry for the following week. I want to be accurate about what those 16 days were like at the station, because the record of what occurred inside the reserve belongs to Yara Austin's field data and not to my intake log, and my intake log is the only instrument I have for describing the time. It was not dramatic. That is the first thing to say. The intake station on a normal operational week processes between 8 and 14 applications, approves 2 or 3 of them for the outer buffer corridor, manages 2 or 3 active permitted entries in the buffer zone at any given time, and receives the usual volume of authority correspondence, regulation updates, budget notifications, routing flags from the Central Directorate about case files approaching administrative review age. I processed all of that during the 16 days. I also processed a resupply delivery on day 7, which required 3 hours of inventory management, and a scheduled maintenance call on day 10 from the authority's facility technician who services our exterior sensor array, who stayed for 4 hours and ate lunch in the station commissary, and did not ask about the human's case file because he did not know there was an active interior entry, and I did not mention it. Day 4, a relay station in the reserve's northern sector transmitted an emergency withdrawal code. I cross-referenced the signal against the current entry log and identified it as the Veth-Koral expedition I had watched preparing from the observation room. They had been in the buffer zone. I logged the code and opened the extraction protocol. The authority's buffer zone extraction team reached them in 6 hours. The team's post-extraction debrief noted that the Veth-Koral expedition had encountered a territory-marking perimeter of one of the reserve's secondary apex species approximately 800 meters inside the buffer boundary. Not the interior, the buffer, and that the encounter had been, in the debrief coordinator's phrasing, physiologically comprehensive. All 16 members were alive. None of them requested re-entry. I noted this in the general log. I did not note it in the human's case file because the human was 4 days into the interior by that point, and the Veth-Koral expedition's experience in the buffer had no operational relevance to her situation. I'm explaining my reasoning because Directive Marshal Saraketh reviewed my filing at the end of that week and asked me, with some emphasis, why I had not cross-referenced the Veth-Koral withdrawal in the human's case file as a relevant safety indicator. I told him that the human was in the interior and that buffer zone encounters were categorically distinct from interior encounters by the authority's own classification framework. He stared at me for a moment. I could see that he wanted to tell me something and could not find a regulatory basis for it. "She's been in there 4 days, he said. 5, I said. It was a Thursday. "Has the monitoring array come back online?" "No." He did not say anything else. He went back to his office and closed the door. The monitoring array for the reserve interior has gone dark on every expedition in the last 40 years at some point between day 2 and day 4. The ecology does not disable it deliberately. The array operates on passive sensor systems that require no active maintenance, but the interior's electromagnetic conditions, which are a byproduct of the local geology interacting with the regional atmospheric chemistry, degrade signal fidelity below threshold after approximately 72 hours. The array comes back online when an expedition exits the interior because the sensor systems recalibrate on the gate's baseline signal. This means that, for any expedition currently inside the reserve, we have no data. We have the entry time. We have the exit time when it occurs. We have whatever the returning party carries out. This is the part of the job I have always found clarifying. You send the forms, you approve the application, you stamp the permit, and then there is a period during which the record contains nothing except an open entry and a blank exit field. The reserve does not report to us. The reserve does not owe us information. The reserve is a Class 15 ecological system that has been accumulating its own history since before the Soviet survey team first mapped it, and our monitoring array is a 40-year-old instrument that it tolerates in the outer buffer and declines to support in the interior. We are, from the reserve's perspective, a clerical function at the edge of something that has no interest in our filing system. I have always found this useful to remember. On day 9, I received an inquiry from the Veth-Koral Secondary Survey Authority asking whether we had a record of Yara Austin's current deployment location. I confirmed that she was in the Veth-Koral Prime Reserve interior. The Veth-Koral Secondary Authority's response was a brief message from someone identified as Deputy Coordinator Veth-Koral, who noted that Austin was one of their licensed independent contractors and asked whether we had an estimated return date. I replied that we did not, the entry permit was open-ended, and that the cable relay was dark. The Deputy Coordinator's reply was a single line, "Understood, she'll come out when she's done." I noted that in the file. Day 7, a routine resupply delivery arrived and I spent 3 hours on inventory. The delivery driver, a Keth-Dorvani logistics contractor who runs this sector loop on a 12-day rotation, asked me if anything interesting had come through. I told him intake volume was normal. He signed the manifest and left. Day 8, Saraketh pulled the reserve's historical incident log and left a printout on my desk without saying anything. I read it. The incident log covered 430 years of managed reserve history in 112 entries. The last 40 years, since the monitoring array's exterior sensors were installed, contained the most detailed records. I read those carefully. The pattern the sensors documented, the acoustic and seismic signature that appeared in the exterior buffer within 72 hours following a significant interior event, appeared in the log 31 times in 40 years. The other 11 entries were from before the sensors existed and were documented through other means. Teams that radioed for extraction, teams that did not radio for extraction and were not found. A single team in year 112, whose surviving member walked back out and wrote a debrief that the authority had since classified at Tier 2 for reasons the classification notation did not explain. I read that debrief's title. I did not have access to the content. The acoustic seismic pattern had not generated since day 4. I noted this in my personal log. The personal log at this point contained 3 brief entries about the Veth-Koral extraction, a note about the monitoring array status, and the observation that the reserve's exterior sensors were producing normal background readings indistinguishable from any other period when there was no active interior entry. This last detail was the one I kept returning to. The exterior sensors cannot see into the interior, but they are sensitive enough to detect the secondary effects of significant interior events: pressure waves, subsonic vocal output from certain apex species, ground vibration from territorial disputes between large-mass animals. In 40 years of operation, those sensors had never registered a 16-day window of clean background signal during an active interior entry. Every prior active entry had generated at least one anomaly pattern by day 4. Most generated several. I did not flag this for Saraketh. There was nothing to flag. The sensors were working. The data was clean. Clean data is not an anomaly in the regulatory sense. It is the absence of an anomaly which is the desired outcome. The system was reporting exactly what it was designed to report. No significant events in the exterior buffer zone. I noted it in my personal log and returned to the intake queue. Day 11, I processed a new application from a Soviet academic institution for a 4-person exterior monitoring study. Cameras and remote sensors placed in the buffer zone. No interior entry. I approved it. The team arrived on day 13 and spent 2 days setting up their array. On the evening of day 14, one of their exterior cameras recorded something moving through the buffer zone at approximately 2:30 local time, heading toward the perimeter gate from the interior side. The camera resolution was insufficient to provide a positive identification. The Sovietian team's field lead, a senior xenobiologist named Veth-Koral, flagged the footage for my review. I reviewed it. The shape was bipedal, moving at a walking pace. It crossed approximately 200 meters of buffer zone terrain in the footage window and passed out of frame toward the gate. I noted this in the station log and checked the gate feed. The gate had not yet registered an exit. Whatever the camera had captured was moving at a walk, not a run. It reached the gate's sensor range, and then the feed showed nothing for approximately 40 minutes. Not because anything blocked it, but because the gate camera's field of view covers only the immediate threshold, and whatever was moving through the buffer zone was moving through the zone rather than directly toward the gate. At 0247:19 on day 16, the gate's pressure plate logged an exit. I was at my desk when it logged. I was not watching the gate feed, because watching the gate feed during active interior entries is not part of my duty protocol. I process the data when it generates. The notification appeared in the lower left corner of my intake queue display as a green flag, which is the color the system assigns to a completed exit event. I looked at the flag for a moment. Then I opened the case file and logged the exit time. I walked to the observation room. Through the window I could see the landing apron at the base of the station's exterior staircase, and on the landing apron I could see Yara Austin sitting on the retaining wall with her survey pack on the ground next to her. She was writing in the field notebook. She had a ration bar in her other hand, and she was eating it in the way people eat when they are finishing a task, and their body has reminded them to fuel, not because they are hungry, but because the task is done and the systems are requesting maintenance. She did not appear injured. She did not appear distressed. She appeared to be completing a note before the thought left her. I looked at her for a while, through the observation room window, in the stillness before I had to go back to my desk and begin the exit processing sequence. She finished the note. She took another bite of the ration bar. She looked out at the reserve's perimeter line, the boundary wire running north across the rock shelf, and her expression was the expression of someone reviewing a piece of work they found adequate. Then she looked down at the notebook and turned the page. I went back to my desk and opened the intake log. I entered the exit time. I noted the duration, 15 days, 18 hours, and 16 minutes. I ran the historical comparison search against the reserve's entry records. The prior record for unescorted interior duration, the single longest unescorted stay before this entry, was 31 hours, achieved by a Vrethani surveyist in year 112 of the reserve's managed history. He had entered the interior, traveled approximately 6 kilometers, and exited under what the record described as controlled emergency retreat. He had been the first person to return from the interior at all. The record had stood for 318 years because no subsequent unescorted entrant had reached 6 kilometers before being extracted or lost. 15 days, 18 hours, and 16 minutes. I noted that in the case file. Directive Marshal Soraketh arrived at my desk 11 minutes after the exit flag generated. I do not know who flagged him. Possibly the system's own alert protocol had reached his personal queue. He stood at the corner of my desk and looked at the file on my display. "She's back," I said. He was quiet. "The exit logged at 2:47, I said. "Duration, 15 days, 18 hours. He looked out through the observation room door, which I had left open. From the intake desk you can see a corner of the window, and through it a corner of the landing apron, and Yara Austin was still sitting on the retaining wall writing in her notebook. He looked at that corner for a long moment. His secondary arms were still. "I want the entry voided," he said. "The practitioner override pathway approval." I looked at him. "She is out of the reserve," I said. "The entry is complete. The case file is closed at exit. You cannot retroactively void a completed entry. I can file a procedural review. You can file a procedural review, I agreed. A procedural review would be reviewed by the Central Directorate. The Central Directorate would review the application chain, which is complete and correctly processed, and the practitioner override documentation, which is verified and endorsed, and the exit record, which is timestamped and logged. The Central Directorate would find no procedural irregularity. He looked at me for a long time. She went in alone, he said. Yes. For 16 days. 15 days, 18 hours and 16 minutes. Into the prime interior. Yes. He put his upper hands flat on my desk, a posture his species uses when they are pressing a point. Nothing survives in there for 16 days, he said. Not in the interior, not unescorted. Nothing has ever survived in there for 16 days. I had been thinking about this. I had been thinking about it since the exit flag generated, and I had been thinking about it before that, in the background, during the 16 days of routine intake work that had occupied the front of my attention. I had been thinking about what it meant that the reserve had not produced a distress signal, had not produced an emergency extraction request, had not produced a body, and had not produced the particular kind of silence that the reserve produces when an entrant has been absorbed into its ecology in the way that the reserve absorbs entrants who do not emerge. The reserve is not silent when it has consumed something. It generates a specific pattern of acoustic and seismic data in the exterior buffer zone in the 72 hours following a significant interior event. A pattern the monitoring array's exterior sensors have documented 41 times in the years they have been operational, and I had been checking those sensors every morning since day 4. The pattern had not generated. Not once. She isn't from a Class 14 world, I said. Not in the way that matters. Saraketh waited. The Veth-Koral secondary origin certification lists her world as Class 14, I said. That is correct. The authorities table puts Class 14 at the lower boundary of what qualifies for practitioner override consideration, but the field log documents 47 days in the Veth-Koral marginal predator zone. The marginal zone is Class 15 Tier 4. This reserve is Class 15 Tier 3. She has spent more time in a higher tier Class 15 environment than any solo entrant in the authorities' records. I paused. I think the classification may be understating the case. What does that mean? He said. I think it means that her origin classification is Class 14, because Class 14 is the ceiling of our measurement table, I said. I think it means the table may have a ceiling problem. He stared at me. She filed the forms correctly, I said. She met the criteria. She entered the reserve, conducted her survey, and exited without incident. The record is clean. There is nothing to review. Saraketh was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened his secondary arms. What did she bring out? He said. I had not yet reviewed what she had brought out. That was the next item in the protocol. The returning entrant submits their field data for intake logging and preliminary cataloging, and the intake officer processes the submission before the Central Directorate receives a copy. I was about to begin that step when Saraketh had appeared at my desk. I haven't processed the submission yet, I said. She would have filed it at the gate terminal when she exited. Saraketh did not say anything else. He went back to his office and closed the door. I pulled up the gate terminal submission queue. The submission was considerable. Yara Austin had filed at 0248, 3797 seconds after her gate exit, a field data package that consisted of the following: 411 botanical specimen photographs with associated taxonomy notes, 32 fauna observation logs with behavioral notation, 14 acoustic recordings from interior locations at varying distances from the perimeter gate, the deepest of which was logged at approximately 63 kilometers from the gate, 6 geological formation surveys. A complete topographical sketch of the interior terrain she had covered, hand-drawn in the field notebook and then photographed, covering an estimated 470 square kilometers, and a separate document she had titled Behavioral Notes, Apex Lode Species, Veth-Koral Prime Interior. Days 115. I opened the Behavioral Notes document. It was 47 pages. I read the first page. I read the second page. I read approximately 8 pages before I set the document aside and sat for a while in the intake station's particular stillness, which is the stillness of a prefab module bolted to a rock shelf at the edge of a Class 15 ecological system that does not acknowledge our presence. The behavioral notes did not contain accounts of battles or narrow escapes. They did not contain accounts of evasion, terror, injury, or loss. They were written in the dry taxonomic register of someone who had been conducting a professional survey of a subject that interested them professionally, and the subject was the interior ecology of a reserve that had killed or extracted every other entrant in its 400-year history. And the notes described that ecology in the way you describe terrain you have walked through carefully and found legible. She had, on day 2, observed what she identified as a primary territory marker for one of the reserve's 3 obligate ambush hunter species. The Veth-Sorvani designation for this species was Apex Primary Designation 1. Internal survey staff referred to it informally as the corridor hunter because it moved through established trail networks and ambushed from structural cover, and she had spent 4 hours observing its behavioral range from a static position upwind before moving on. Her note on the encounter was 3 paragraphs. The third paragraph read, behavioral signature consistent with a high apex territorial predator that hunts by triggering flight response in prey species. The relevant counter behavior is not flight. Movement pattern suggests this species relies on prey's instinct to move rapidly away from a threat stimulus. Predator follows the movement rather than the source. Staying still and staying upwind appears to remove the primary trigger. Note for future, this species is a danger to running. On day 5, she had encountered what she identified as a secondary apex, the 4th-tier ambush species that the monitoring array's exterior sensors had recorded 17 times in incident logs, always in the context of significant event patterns. Her note was 6 paragraphs. The first paragraph read, larger than the reserve documentation suggested. Visual estimate approximately 3 times the mass indicated in the authority's exterior survey data from year 70. Possible that the interior population has developed differently from the buffer zone population the exterior sensors have captured. More significantly, operates in pairs rather than alone, which the exterior data does not record. The pairing behavior explains the anomalous incident pattern in the monitoring logs. What the exterior sensors were reading as a single significant event was 2 animals working a coordinated approach, which means the interior incident ecology has been systematically undercounted. Filing this separately under the fauna observation logs, reference number 14. Her note on her personal response to the encounter was in the 6th paragraph. Maintained position in the tree line for approximately 3 hours until both animals relocated. Ate lunch. The secondary apex appears to hunt primarily by thermal signature tracking at range, which makes it a different problem from the corridor hunter, but a solvable one. The tree line provides adequate thermal break. Note for future. Do not cross open ground between 1,000 and 1,400 local, which appears to be the active hunting window for this species. Ate lunch. I sat with that for a while. The ecological incident logs for the reserve's exterior sensors contain 41 significant event records over 40 years. The language those records use to describe encounters with the secondary apex species is not maintained position in the tree line for 3 hours. The language those records use is language developed by the authorities' incident documentation team to describe events with definitive outcome parameters. Extraction completed, entrant non-functional, entrant non-recovered. 41 records. In 47 pages of behavioral notes, the secondary apex was referenced in 7 separate entries, always in the same dry taxonomic register, always with a counter behavior identified, and a note for future reference filed. I thought about the pairing behavior she had documented, 2 animals working a coordinated approach, which the exterior monitoring had been reading for 40 years as single-animal incidents. The systematic undercounting that implied. I thought about what it meant that she had identified this undercounting not from archived data, but from direct observation on day 5, while maintaining a static position upwind in the tree line. The exterior sensors had been measuring shadows on the wall. She had been in the room. On day 7 of her interior stay, she had documented what she described as a behavioral boundary survey. Moving through the corridor, hunters established territory markers to map the territorial limits, which she had inferred from scent deposition patterns and track concentration. Her note read, "Territorial range appears to be approximately 16 square kilometers centered on the main trail network, with secondary pressure zones extending 4 to 6 kilometers east and west. The pressure zones correspond to the transition terrain between the trail network and the open valley floor, transitional habitat that the corridor hunter uses for ambush staging, but does not hold permanently. Movement through the pressure zones is feasible in the morning before 700, when the corridor hunter's behavioral pattern suggests a rest period following overnight territorial patrol. The trail network itself I am treating as corridors of last resort usable under specific conditions but not for routine transit. Then a line break and then, current position, eastern pressure zone, moving north through the transitional terrain toward the interior valley system. 6:18 local time. The light here is good. The light here is good." I read that line twice, and then closed the document and looked out the intake station window at the boundary wire for a while. On day 9, she had observed what she described as a coordinated territorial engagement between the corridor hunter and one of the reserve's 3 flocking predator species. The kind of multi-species interaction that the authorities' scientific advisory panel had theorized might occur in the interior, but had never been able to document because no entrant had survived long enough in the interior to observe it. Her note was 11 paragraphs. The 11th read, "The territorial displacement resolved in approximately 90 minutes. The corridor hunter withdrew north. The flock species maintained the central valley floor for the remainder of the observation window before dispersing at dusk. I moved through the corridor hunter's vacated territory during the displacement, which provided a clean 3-hour transit window into the interior's eastern quadrant. The ecology here has a logic. It just requires paying attention. The ecology here has a logic." I read that line 3 times. On day 12, she had encountered what she noted was likely the interior's primary apex, the species that the authorities' biological database listed in the reserve's file under the notation interior apex, unclassified due to insufficient observation data, which meant that in 430 years of managed reserve history, no entrant had survived an encounter long enough to provide usable documentation. Her note on the encounter was 22 paragraphs. The first paragraph read, "Visual at 60 meters, unclassified species, consistent with the incomplete data in the authorities' database, considerably larger than any previous observation on record. Unclear whether the database's notation of unclassified reflects insufficient data or deliberate classification suppression. Will flag for the directorate." The fourth paragraph, "Initial approach behavior appears calibrated to provoke rapid withdrawal. Counter behavior remains still. The approach slowed at approximately 40 meters and stalled at 35. Conclusion, the triggering mechanism is movement, not presence." This species has almost certainly never encountered a prey-class organism that did not move when it advanced. The ninth paragraph. By hour 2, the animal had settled into what I would characterize as observational posture. It was no longer approaching, but it was watching. At one point, it moved laterally to a position that gave it a better sightline to my left profile. I turned to keep it in direct view. It stopped moving. We held that for approximately 6 minutes. Then it moved to a second lateral position. I turned again. It stopped again. This sequence repeated 4 times. My working hypothesis is that it was testing whether I would brake and run during the repositioning. The answer appears to have been relevant new information. The 22nd paragraph read, the encounter lasted approximately 4 hours. The animal is intelligent in the sense that it models environmental variables rather than simply responding to stimuli, which places it in a different behavioral category than the corridor hunter and the secondary apex. It spent the first hour establishing my position relative to its own and evaluating my response to its preliminary approach behavior. When my response was no response, it appeared to recalibrate. We spent approximately 2 hours in what I would describe as mutual observation. On hour 4, it relocated eastward. I noted its track direction for future reference and continued north. I ate dinner at approximately 18:30. The data on this species alone will require a separate report. I filed a notation in the case, record that a supplementary report on the unclassified interior apex would be forthcoming. Then I sat for a long time at my intake desk, in the stillness of the prefab module, with the reserves monitoring array dark behind me, and the landing apron outside and Yara Austin's case file open on my display. And I tried to write a summary notation for the central directorate that accurately described what had just occurred. The difficulty was not the facts. The facts were in the file: entry date, exit date, duration, field data volume, verification documentation, endorsement chain, liability waiver, entry fee, correctly processed practitioner override approval. The facts were clean and complete. The central directorate would receive them and file them, and the case would be closed. The difficulty was the classification field. The authority's case file system requires a classification entry for completed reserve entries. The options are successful traverse, partial traverse, assisted extraction, emergency extraction, non-return. For entries lasting more than 10 days in the interior, the system also requests a secondary notation field for outcome category, with the following options: data recovered, data incomplete, entrant lost, entrant deceased. She had been in the interior for 15 days and 18 hours. She had conducted what appeared to be the most comprehensive single-entrant ecological survey of the Veth-Koral prime interior in the reserve's 400-year history. She had documented a previously unclassified apex species. She had produced the first behavioral record of multi-species apex interaction in the reserve's interior. She had identified a systematic undercounting error in the monitoring array's 40-year incident log. She had exited without assistance, without injury, and without, as best I could determine from 47 pages of field notes, anything that she had found particularly remarkable about the preceding 15 days. The classification options available to me were successful traverse, partial traverse, assisted extraction, emergency extraction, non-return. I selected successful traverse. The secondary notation field asked for outcome category: data recovered, data incomplete, entrant lost, entrant deceased. I selected data recovered. Then I sat and looked at those 2 classifications and understood that they were the correct classifications under the system's framework, and that they were completely inadequate to the actual content of what I had just processed. At 8:31, Yara Austin knocked on the intake station's exterior door. I opened it. She had the field notebook in one hand and the survey pack slung over one shoulder. She looked, at close range, about what she had looked like at a distance from the observation room: a person who had been doing outdoor work for 2 weeks and had not been significantly impeded by it. There was a healing abrasion on her left forearm. Her boots had seen better days. "I need to submit a supplementary report on the interior apex," she said. "The main submission went through the gate terminal, but I wasn't sure whether the case file was still open for supplementary materials." "It is," I said. "Good." She handed me a folded document from the notebook's interior pocket. "That's a preliminary overview. The full report will take longer, probably a month, maybe 6 weeks. I'll file it through the Veth-Koral Secondary Authority and flag it to your central directorate." I took the document. It was 14 pages, handwritten. "The unclassified apex," I said, "in the interior." "Yes." I looked at the first page. "You have a species naming recommendation in here. The naming guidelines say the first person to file adequate observational data on an unclassified species gets to submit a naming proposal to the biological registry. I checked before I filed the gate submission." She paused. "I checked the guidelines before I went in, actually." "Before you went in," I said. "I wanted to make sure the data would count," she said. "No point spending 2 weeks in there if the paperwork doesn't hold." I looked at her for a moment. 53 kilos, 1.62 meters, survey clothing, healing abrasion, worn boots, field notebook. "Is there anything else you need from the station before you file onward?" I asked. "A resupply from the station commissary if that's available," she said. "I have a secondary survey site north of the reserve boundary, not interior, just the exterior approach geology, and I'd like to spend another few days on it before I head back." "The commissary is available to entrance within 48 hours of exit," I said. "Your exit was logged at 2:47. The commissary is in Building 2, second level." "Thank you," she said. She adjusted the strap of the survey pack and walked toward Building 2. I went back to my desk. I entered the supplementary report into the case file. I noted the species naming proposal, which I flagged for the biological registry under the appropriate routing protocol. I entered a note in the file's administrative history field. Entrant conducted complete interior survey, duration 15 days 18 hours, unescorted, all data recovered. No extraction required. No emergency protocols activated. Entrant exited independently and filed complete data package at gate terminal within 2 minutes of exit. Supplementary report on unclassified interior apex to follow. See attached documentation chain for practitioner override approval. Classification, successful traverse. I looked at that note for a while. Then I added one line below it, in the administrative history field, which is technically for procedural notations and not for the intake officer's personal observations, but which I have been filling in for 19 years and which the Central Directorate reads once per quarter and has never asked me to stop. Note for the Central Directorate's classification review. The practitioner override pathways hazard equivalency table lists Class 14 as the qualification ceiling. This case suggests the ceiling may not be measuring what we think it is measuring. The entrance notes describe the reserve's interior ecology as having a logic that rewards careful attention. I recommend the authority's scientific advisory panel review the hazard equivalency table's upper boundary. The instrument appears to be calibrated for the species that have applied so far. It was not calibrated for this one. I filed the case. Then I made a notation in my personal log, not the authority's log, my own, which I have kept since my first year at this station, and which documents the things the intake queue does not have fields for. The notation was brief. She came out on day 16. She had surveyed data on 470 square kilometers of interior terrain, 6 apex species documented and behaviorally characterized, and 1 unclassified animal that 400 years of managed reserve history had not produced enough observation time to name. She ate her lunch in the reserve's interior on day 2 and her dinner on day 12, and the entries in her behavioral notes around both of those events are written in the same dry taxonomic register as the rest of the document. The unclassified apex spent 4 hours with her on day 12 and relocated eastward. She noted its track direction for future reference and continued north. The ecology has a logic. She said so, and I think she was right, and I think she had understood the logic of the reserve the way she understood the logic of her intake forms, not because it was simple, but because she had read it carefully and found it legible. The form, the Appendix C provision, the verification protocol, the endorsement requirement, the species naming guidelines checked in advance so the paperwork would hold. She had read those the same way she read the secondary apex's hunting window and the corridor hunter's trigger mechanism and the territorial displacement pattern on day 9. They were all the same kind of problem, systems with internal logic, once you paid attention. The monitoring array came back online at 8:59, 50 minutes after she walked out. I noted the reconnect time in the station log and returned to the intake queue. There were 3 new applications pending. All 3 were for the outer buffer visitor corridor. I processed them in order, approved the one that met the minimum group requirement, denied the other 2, and filed the denial letters before 1100. At 11:30, Directive Marshal Saraketh came to my desk and stood for a moment without saying anything. "The case file is closed," I said. He nodded. "The Central Directorate will have the package by end of day," I said. "The supplementary report on the apex species is flagged for the biological registry. The species naming proposal is in the routing queue." He looked at the observation room window. Through it, the landing apron was empty. Yara Austin had gone north toward the exterior geology site an hour earlier. The apron was just rock and railing and morning light on the boundary wire. 15 days, he said. 18 hours, I said. He was quiet for a moment. What do we do with that? I thought about the classification fields I had filled in. I thought about the 47 pages. I thought about day 12. 60 meters, 4 hours, relocated eastward, continued north. "We update the table," I said, "and we note what the record shows." He nodded once slowly, then he went back to his office. I returned to the intake queue. The apron was still empty. The reserve was still dark in the way it is always dark between expeditions, quiet, in the manner of things that have been here longer than our monitoring arrays, and will be here after our administrative module is gone. The morning light moved across the boundary wire. I filed the case under successful traverse and closed the window. That was the accurate notation, and it was the only one the system had. It was not, I have thought since, the right size of notation for what it described. But the record shows what the record shows. She went in on a Tuesday. She walked out 16 days later with 411 botanical photographs, a 47-page behavioral study, and a species naming proposal filed 97 seconds after the gate logged her exit. Nobody went in to get her. Nobody needed to. The reserve's exterior sensors ran their full 16-day acoustic check and produced nothing. The classification table has a ceiling. She walked through it. That is what the record shows.